Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam. I am standing in for the chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee of the Section on Business Law. I'm happy to welcome everybody to the 16th weekly series. This edition promises to be exciting, informative, and we are taking on the energy transition and we're focusing on renewables. So I would I'll start by introducing our panelists. And before I go on to introduce our panelists, I would want to say that we want to commend the Section of Leadership, the Council and Chairman of the Section of Business Law for this initiative to have a weekly sessions where we share knowledge and what's happening in the industry. So for us, we're very happy and excited to have Dr. Oko with us. She was ahead of her time. She's has been an expert in this space of environmental transition, energy, and renewable. And she's going to give us the ground presentation. That will be followed by our own Mr. Israel Ahi. Mr. Israel Ahi is an executive director with Aspen Energy, one of the front-line energy companies that's focusing on renewables. He's also managing partner of commercial and energy law practice. And he's just a partner, and he's also a infotech entrepreneur. And I'm sure some of us are familiar with one work. And yes. So thank you. So without much ado, we're going to keep to time. We're a few minutes late. I will yield the floor to Dr. Oko to give her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sam, for that very kind introduction. As I said, I'm Dr. Bonahis Oko, Head of Sustainability for Solvin. A very warm welcome to everyone here today. Thank you for being here, and we are very thrilled to see so many of you on the call. For my portion for today's session, it will be all about the climate change challenge, some key global regulatory milestones, a quick look at the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC's synthesis report, Nigeria's energy transition plan, and a quick look at the SDG goals the plan will address, and finally, renewables and the factors affecting energy transition. So to provide some clarity and understanding, especially for those who are new to the topic of sustainability, I think it'll be better or beneficial to talk about things in this order. This will also be an opportunity for us as professionals to not only commit to the targets set out in the Paris Agreement and renew that COP26 and COP27, but to use our influence with local governments, legislators, C-suite executives to push for policy change, both with governments and non-state actors as we head towards COP28. Next slide, please. Next slide, Sam. Right, so as you can see on the screen, you're likely looking at the world map, and the recent temperature gradient. So it's showing temperature gradient from 1850s to 2020. So as a society, we are seeing more frequently the impacts of the climate crisis, whether it's the recent flash floods in Saudi Arabia, of all places where they received 3 years worth of rain in 6 hours, to Switzerland's vanishing glaciers, to the recent flooding in Pakistan, which put a third of the country underwater, displacing millions, decimating livestock and feed for farming, to the 37 million people in the Horn of Africa facing food insecurity, which follows over 4 years of intense drought. From the UK's temperature reaching 40 degrees centigrade over the last summer, to the recent flooding in Nigeria and parts of West Africa, which killed several hundreds. displacing over 1 million and forcing new migration routes for livestock, increasing the potential for conflict between local farmers and herders, to heat waves in the US, half of Europe under drought warning, the worst drought in China's history and in the US in the last 500 years. The images on the screen should show belong to Berkeley Earth. The image to the left is the global temperature rise from 1850 to 2020. And we can see a steady increase during this time period up until 2020, when temperature reaches 1.2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial revolutions. At the bottom of the world map to your right is a scale with a color gradient from deep blue to dark red. It correlates with temperature, so the deeper the red on the map, the more intense the global warming in that area compared to what it should be. Africa, the Middle East, Europe, parts of North and South America, and even down south at the Antarctica show temperature rise well above 1.5 degrees temperature. This has been the consequence of a century of burning fossil fuel, as well as unequal and unsustainable energy and land use. The result is more frequent and intense extreme weather events that have caused increasingly dangerous impacts on nature and people in every regions of the world. Climate-driven food and water insecurity is expected to grow with increased warming. When the risks combine with other adverse effects such as pandemic or conflicts, they become even more difficult to manage. It is obvious that no matter where in the world we look, we are touched, or wherever we live, we are all being touched by the undeniable impacts of climate change. One thing is clear though, we have one home on planet Earth, and looking after it is our collective responsibility. Slide 4, please, regulatory environment. In response to the anthropogenic global warming emergency, governments around the world have responded, slowly in some cases without coherency or consistency, but they have responded. And here's a quick look at a few of these responses. The Stern Review of 2006, commissioned by the UK Treasury, looked at the effect of global warming on the world's economy, with key findings indicating that doing nothing will cost us 5 to 20% of GDP, and taking action then could reduce this to 2%. The UK's Climate Change Act of 2008 and the 2019 Net Zero Amendments, it commits the UK government by law to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050, and in Scotland by 2045. The Paris Agreement of 2015 at COP21, it's a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties, and its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial level. The EU Green Deal of 2019, the Australia Climate Change Act of 2022, Singapore Green Plan 2030, US climate change policy, which is developed at local, state, and federal levels of government, and the Nigerian Climate Change Act of 2021, which provides Nigeria with a legal framework for the country to achieve its climate goals, achieve its long-term social and economic sustainability and resilience. The Act enacts an overarching objective of achieving net zero emissions between 2050 and 2070. These laws, acts, pacts, deals, whatever you want to call them, all have one thing in common: set the nation state on a pathway to achieving net zero in line with the Paris Agreement of 2015. Slide 5, please. So we should be looking at COP27 highlights and the road to COP28. Unfortunately, I really can't see the slides. I just see myself on the screen. So I thought I'll quickly touch on the key highlights from COP27, seeing as it was recently took place in Africa in November last year. And as we all look on towards COP28, it'll be important and beneficial to have a big look at the key highlights from COP27. So countries reaffirmed their commitments to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They strengthened actions to cut greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change, as well as boost the support finance, technology, capacity building needed by developing countries. Still, many were disappointed that the final text from the implementation plan was watered down with regards to the phasing out of fossil fuel. The global methane pledge commitment to reduce methane by 30% this decade reached 150 nations. The International Organization for Standardization published a net zero guideline paper. It removes the confusion of what net zero means, creating a single text for organizations and public and private sector looking to create and publish net zero targets. So if your company wants to create a net zero target, this is a good one to use. Commitments to double adaptation finance following COP26 in Glasgow the previous year were maintained, and Egypt used its presidency at COP27 to launch the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, which includes actions to improve resiliency for more than 4 billion people across the world. Major focus was given at COP27 to ensure that net zero targets by non-state actors are credible, with the UN high-level expert group on net zero emissions publishing a set of recommendations on how to set up net zero commitments. It's also a good one to look at if your company is looking to set up net zero strategy. Finally, the parties made the decision to support loss and damage, and the financial mechanism by which this agreement will be established will be determined this year and presented at COP28. Next slide, please. So COP27 and the construction industry. I thought I'll talk about this because of the 5 key sectors that are involved or that have been used in the Nigerian transition plan. There's intersectionality with the construction industry. And the construction industry contributes globally 40% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. So I thought I'll pull together articles relating to the construction industry from COP27. The Global Status Report for Building and Construction found that emissions and energy demands have increased beyond the pre-pandemic peak. The sector is not on track to achieve decarbonization by 2050. The World Green Building Council has set up a bold new vision that by 2030, all new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have at least 40% less embodied carbon with significant upfront carbon reduction, and all new buildings are net zero operational carbon. Finally, the 2022 IEA data shows that the built environment generates 40% of annual global CO2 emissions. Of these emissions, building operation are responsible for 27%. So building operation, how you use your building, heating, cooling, cooking, heating up water, things like that, responsible for 27% of the total annual emissions, while building an infrastructure, material and construction. So actually building the facilities or residential and non-residential developments, typically referred to as embodied carbon, are responsible for an additional 13%. Next slide, please. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On Monday this week, the IPCC released a new synthesis report. The document is important because 195 governments commissioned it, and the summary was agreed line by line. It is accepted fact by nations worldwide and a shared basis for future action. The report's conclusions are terrifying and wearily familiar. Every region is experiencing widespread adverse effects. Almost half of the world's population is highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. Expected repercussions will escalate rapidly. And it concludes that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. Time is short, but there is a clear path forwards. And if temperatures are to be kept at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, deep, rapid, and sustained greenhouse gas emissions reductions will need to be conducted in all sectors this decade. Emission needs to go down now and be cut by almost half by 2030 if this goal has any chance of being achieved. although this is not in the slide, but just for the people who might not have any idea of why we are here and all this talk about carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, what do they have to do with any of this? So carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases act like a blanket or cap in the atmosphere, trapping infrared radiation, which would otherwise escape if unimpeded. This infrared radiation is re-emitted back in all directions, and about half of it returns back to Earth and warms the planet. The CO2 particles are very long-lived, and so once they're in the atmosphere, they take a really long time to come back down again. A direct correlation between our consumption of fossil fuel and the corresponding increase in global temperature concentrations and greenhouse gas concentration has been scientifically established. Limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade will be exceeded during this century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gases occur in the coming decades. Next slide, please. The Nigeria's energy transition plan. The ETP sets out a timeline and framework for the attainment of emissions. The reductions across 5 key sectors: power, cooking, oil and gas, transport, and industry. All of these key sectors have links to the construction industry, like I mentioned before, in building of infrastructure for transport, power, oil and gas, and industry, and in buildings of homes and facilities where people live, where they cook, where they use water, heating, things like that, which would mean we'll be looking at emissions generating from operating the home. It would also mean emissions from heating, cooling, or just generally operating the buildings. Next slide, please. The key objectives for the ETP and how they align to the SDG goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015. They share a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and planet, now and into the future. Our ETP, the Nigerian ETP objectives list lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty and driving economic growth. We'll be targeting SDG goals 1, 2, and 10. Bringing modern energy services to the full population. We'll be targeting goals 7, 9, and 11. Managing the expected long-term job loss in the oil sector due to the reduced global fossil fuel demand. We'll be targeting goals 1, 2, 8, and 10. Playing a leadership role for Africa by promoting a fair, inclusive, and equitable energy transition in Africa that will include gas as a transitional fuel. We'll be targeting goals 10 and 13, sorry. And then finally, streamlining existing and new government-related energy transition initiatives. Next slide, please. So we're looking at the 4 pillars to energy transition. What will be important? What would be needed to ensure that we can actually do this? And one of these is collaboration and just transition. The importance of industrial transparency. People need to know what you're doing and why. Industrial transparency, ensuring your organization is aligned with extra-industrial perceptions. Governing transformation, the use of national policy framework, such as the ETP, and the global regulatory landscape are shaping the course of transition change. Accelerating the energy transition, clear pathways to converting climate ambitions like the Nigerian Climate Change Act and corporate commitments into concrete action. And finally, readiness for a green economy. The role of capital and investment flow in incentivizing businesses transformation. All across the world, green finance is taking center stage. You have GFANs, you have EU taxonomy, you have TCFD. People are wanting to know exactly what organizations are doing to address climate change in their own capacity, and banks and financial houses are now tying in loans and things like that into the green economy. So that's one thing to think about to your organizations, especially if you're going to apply for grants or finances. Next slide, please, slide 11. So energy transformation cannot happen without changing the power grid infrastructure, as well as the software associated with that. And in my opinion, digital twins will play a role in this, but that's a conversation for another day. If you talk about energy transition, there are three dilemmas at present to energy transition. Sustainability is a major theme. We're trying to achieve net zero and eliminate carbon from the planet as much as possible. This is driving significant amount of the challenges on the grid. For example, generation today comes from a mix of renewables. An example is in the UK, it comes from a mix of renewables, thermal, solar, etc., especially in more progressive nations. You also have the issue of intermittent supply. So you have to address challenges like that. The sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, so this will have to be addressed. Aging infrastructure in the grid, which will make it more vulnerable to climate impacts. And also, as we move more and more into the distributed energy resources, opening the grid to the internet with transformation happening due to digitalization, it is opening the grid to attacks such as cyber threats, which are increasing significantly in more developed countries. So resilience in this area, and lastly, affordability of energy, and which is why it was a good thing. That's one of the key objectives of the Nigerian ETP, ensuring a fair transition, a fair and just transition. Everyone desires low-cost electricity, but some of the previous generation and conventional sources of energy, they're not only reliable, they're also very cheap. So how to get this electricity to everyone in an equitable manner is a dilemma for energy transition. Next slide, please. Slide 12. The path to a decentralized, decarbonized energy landscape requires a transition to low carbon energy systems, which integrates renewables and storage solutions. However, it is important to recognize that the effectiveness of different renewable energy options will vary from place to place. It's therefore important to carry out a detailed analysis prior to investing in renewables to ensure that decisions are based around which solutions will best serve the community, the site in question, while also providing a feasible return on investment. Next slide, please. So we have different types of renewable energy. Sunlight is our planet's most abundant and freely available energy resource. The amount of solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface in 1 hour is more than the planet's total energy requirements for a whole year. And although it sounds like a perfect renewable energy source, the amount of solar energy we use varies according to the time of the day and the season of the year, as well as the geographical location. Wind is also a plentiful source of clean energy. Wind farms are becoming an increasingly familiar sight in developed countries, with wind power making an ever-increasing contribution to the national grid for several nations. To harness electricity from wind energy, turbines are used to drive generators, which then feed the electricity into the national grid. As a renewables energy source, hydropower is one of the most commercially developed. By building a dam or a barrier, a large reservoir can be used to create a controlled flow of water to generate electricity. Geothermal energy, by harnessing the natural heat from the Earth's surface, geothermal energy can be used to heat homes directly or generate electricity. And although it harnesses its power directly from our feet, it's negligible in places like the UK as compared to other countries like Iceland. I do think this is a source of energy which will be particularly effective and efficient if used in Nigeria because of how hot the country can get. And finally, biomass energy. is the conversion of solid fuel made from plant material into electricity. It involves burning biomass, organic material to produce electricity. It's a cleaner source of energy. And finally, I just point out that fossil fuel are not a renewable source of energy because they're not infinite. They also release carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, which contributes to climate change and global warming. So that's me. Thank you very much. Sam, back to you.
Thank you very much. Packed so much into that short time. We're hoping that when we have a full day session at the conference, we might have an opportunity to have an extended discussion. Taking into consideration the time, I'll keep my questions for now, and I would yield the floor for Israel to make his presentation. So, do you have any comments on Dr. Oko's presentation before you start?
Like you, I would reserve my questions for the Q&A session, but except perhaps to mention, I'm just going into this one, that we're lucky to have Dr. Oko on this, because this is as comprehensive an overview as I've seen anywhere. But I like to think that it covered essentially just about everything. So thank you very much, Dr. So just not to take too much of our time, it would feel to me like what is the keynote for this has been delivered. Just as soon as Sam gets us into this, then I'll get into a bit of my own intervention. And you'd see that what I've attempted to do, essentially, I have about 3 slides. And thank God I didn't even attempt to get into the substance of what the energy transition is in the way that the experts have quite deftly done. But what I'm trying to do here essentially is to contextualize the conversation and to help us also get into to basically Sam, what are we doing? Playing with it. All right, yeah, and to get into perhaps to surface the elephant in the room. Because again, if you're having an energy transition, renewable type conversation in Nigeria, then you have to contend with the fact that the average Nigerian is filled with some sort of trepidation and fear, and because we basically are a mono-product economy, and what we hear is that era is about to disappear. And indeed, when there is any kind of volatility or uncertainty in the fossil fuel economy, you see just the direct impact. As of today, there's hardly any buffer, between ourselves and any potential impacts to the fossil fuel economy. So it raises a few questions, and those are the things I've attempted to address here. So the first thing I said here is facts and what the facts and what the myths are. And I've just tried to put them side by side, to almost like dispel perhaps the myth. And so fact number one, and this is nothing close to, like I said, the background we have received, is that energy storage technology is rapidly improving, okay? Making it possible to share renewable energy for use when it is needed. And which has been one of the really major concerns around renewable energy. And because when you talk about the energy transition, you're talking essentially about the transition from, the fossil fuel based and or driven economy to renewable energy. And so some of the thought out there is that, well, renewable energy is unreliable, it is not as available, sustainably as it is possible. And that's probably a lot of folks' experience. I mean, if you have solar power, in the early days, the panels were very significantly expensive. And even if you cover the entire rooftop with solar panels, it seems as if it power just a few bulbs, not maybe enough to be able to sustain lifestyles, to carry ACs and the likes of it. So I'm grounding the conversation the best I can, but that's changing, and it's changing very rapidly. And it can only get better. I mean, again, panels are getting smaller, they're becoming more affordable, they're becoming more available. So that's something to say. The second sort of set of issues, and this is by no means exhaustive, is that the fact is renewable energy sources are becoming increasingly cost competitive, which is the point I made, vis-a-vis fossil fuel, and anticipated to become significantly cheaper soon. So the myth around that is that renewable energy is too expensive and not feasible as replacement to conventional energy sources. So another myth, perhaps to sort of dispel, is that investment in renewable energy has been, I think there is just that, there seems to be just a position that, but I think the myth here essentially is that it's going to lead to loss of jobs, loss of opportunities, and the likes of it. But it's important to mention that many countries have ambitious targets for transitioning to renewable energy, and indeed, so for example, Costa Rica has been operating on 100% renewable energy for over 5 years. And I think somewhere in my slide, I don't know if it's in this one or the next one, you'll see, no, we'll get to the next one yet. Just stay with this one. Exactly. You see that one of the points that was made there is that in comparative terms, renewable energy will create more opportunities, will create more jobs, will create more revenue to the economy very well if it's properly managed. Okay, so we say the transition. So fact is, transition to renewable energy is driven by concerns over climate change, which have been very well set out in Dr. Bo's presentation, depletion of non-renewable resources, and the desire for energy independence, particularly with respect to some of the countries in the Western Hemisphere or the global North. Those in the global North that probably are very energy thirsty or fossil fuel thirsty, and have had to depend on some regions of the world for their energy supply. So that's one of the big drivers around that. Now, of course, the myth that sort of counterposes is that fossil fuels are still necessary to meet our energy needs, and declining cost of renewable energy and the increasing accessibility of energy storage technology means that a complete transition to renewable energy is becoming increasingly feasible. That's almost like a counterpost to it. All right, let's go to the next slide, which is my penultimate slide. And so, surfacing a bit of the, if you will, elephant in the room is the first one position I take here is that opportunity, and that the energy transition and the transition towards renewable energy presents an opportunity, to Nigeria and indeed to many sub-Saharan African countries to leapfrog the rest of the world in terms of power availability to its rapidly growing population. And that's a very bold statement to make, and I'll see to what extent I can, help to ground that. And indeed, in my opinion, there is no counterpost to that, to be honest with you. There's no counterpost to that. And what comes to mind essentially is telecoms. People forget today, and I've seen, I believe many people have seen situations where even persons, and I do not intend to denigrate any human being, but persons, we've seen even beggars, with phones and with full access to phones and all the functionality of a smartphone, for example, But that is a testimony, in my opinion, to the availability and the penetration of that particular technology. So sometimes when the underlying technology changes, whereas it creates fears, VUCA basically produces fears, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, creates all of that. But beneath it, always, if we manage the transition properly, is that we can get to a new day of far more opportunities than the things that and what we're leaving behind. So that's the sort of first stake in the ground statement that I want to make. The second one is that the disruption, what probably is considered a threat, is that is the disruption of traditional energy economies. Just basically those who are embedded in house, the IOCs, the NOCs, and all the current structure, as it were. People forget that in the old days, you had a total of 400 lines, for all of Nigeria, perhaps half of which were unavailable as a result of, the technology of tangled wires and all that. But that had an economy too. There were people who worked within that particular system, call them winners, and potentially losers in the transitional situation. But overall, you would agree that, the society benefited even from the transition to the GSM technology and on as we have it today, to the various generations of 2G, 3G, 4G, and we're now at the brink of 5G. I think one or two of the networks are already testing or piloting that in country as well. So you'd find that, yes, it is going to disrupt to some extent, and timelines is something we're probably going to be looking at, some of those economic. Indeed, the argument is that switching to renewable energy sources can help some African countries reduce the dependence on imported fossil fuel, which can improve energy security and help keep energy costs affordable. The third point here is renewable energy projects can be expensive, and African countries may struggle to secure funding to implement. And I think those arguments have been made in successive COP meetings. I think the loudest deal we heard was probably in COP27, and some of Dr. Bu's presentation indeed shows how much attention has been given to that and how much money is being separated and set aside to be able to capitalize, the transition to renewables. So as African countries increasingly adopt renewable energy technologies, new job opportunities will likely arise in areas such as maintenance, installation, and management of renewable energy projects. And look, as somebody who's worked in-house with an IOC before, I can tell you that persons who are directly employed in-house, to combine all the sort of oil companies in Nigeria, I would be generous to allocate 200,000 people to that number. I don't know what Sam feels, or some of you on the call. It doesn't employ that many, and particularly the way we structured our own sort of fossil fuel economy, it's been based largely on what we call win, work, and carry away. Unfortunately, we didn't even expand our fossil fuel economy in order to be able to create that sort of multiply effect and create opportunities for folks within the country. So that's another discussion, to have. So on a like-for-like basis, there's no doubt in my mind that the renewable energy economy is going to create more opportunities. Okay. And then, of course, something that may be considered a threat is the limited infrastructure. Many African countries lack the infrastructure needed to support renewable energy projects, such as grid infrastructure, storage facilities, and the likes. But the rest, all the world is learning that space. And again, to my first point, it's an opportunity for us to leapfrog, and quite frankly, come to some sort of parity with the rest of the world. I mean, if you take telephony penetration today, Nigeria is as good as any part of the world, in terms of, the telephone penetration to the economy, just because the underlying technology changed. And I think that we can learn along with the world, and be able to deal with this. And by the way, I think we have the opportunity to get involved in the storage race, because some parts of Africa produces lithium, and if we got involved in that particular space, we probably would get into the whole battery business. And finally, in the threats and opportunities, something that is considered a threat would be that developing and implementing renewable energy technologies in Africa may require significant technical expertise, which may not yet be available in many parts of the world. Now, for me, the opportunity is inherent in the threat. And as a general statement, we can make the point and agree that there is a capacity gap for development in Nigeria and perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, from leadership to technical ability and all of that. Now, but you know, it's similar to if we have the conversation around infrastructure deficit or gap. The opportunities inherent within the threat that what we consider the threat indeed is a flip side of the opportunity. So transitioning to renewable energy presents many opportunities for new jobs in the renewable energy sector. So now to essentially my final slide on the subject. And so overall, the energy transition to renewable energy presents both challenges and opportunities for African countries. While there are certainly some hurdles to overcome, with the right support and investment, the benefits of transitioning to renewable energy will far outweigh just tiring. And so here's some analysis I've attempted to do and to break, and this is really bringing it out. There's a 45 seconds advert. You know, I had a debate with that, but it's for a company. I didn't speak with them, and I definitely don't want to use this platform to push any sort of brand. But you know, it says, look, when the conversation comes to net zero and net profit, you know, our response is why not both? You know, and if you look at it very carefully, you know, it's not a disaster scenario for Nigeria, and it's important that people see that. You know, and sometimes the reason why, you know, we tend to become overcome or overwhelmed by these kinds of situations is the tendency for us to take a zero-sum approach. And it's hardly ever that. I mean, if you remember, when Britain voted to Brexit, they didn't Brexit the next day. There was a transitional phase. You know, and so even as the conversation around, you know, movement was net zero and the transition away from fossil fuel to renewable energy is on, this, as far as I'm aware, is not something that is likely to happen tomorrow. And you know, look, even within the spectrum of fossil fuel, the age of coal is supposed to have passed. But as we speak, there are still coal plants in some parts of the world. And as a matter of fact, when there was a shock after the, what do you call it now? When there was a shock after the conflict between Russia and Ukraine started, a few countries went back and fired up their coal plants again. So my point is that this is hardly ever a zero-sum game. And again, if you think about the fact that, you know, fossil fuel is not entirely used only for the generation of energy, but there are a few derivatives that come out of fossil fuel that are relevant to industrial processes. Plastics, you know, a few of those sort of inputs into industrial processes come from that. So my sense of it, and this is probably an audacious point to make, and maybe not such an audacious point to make, is that, you know, fossil fuel to a reasonable extent will be with us for a while. You know, maybe not at the kind of levels we see. So here is my analysis, that there is a pre-net zero phase. And I think that there is potentially a 30 to 50 year window to maximize yield revenue from fossil fuel. And if you see some of the Gulf states are doing that very well, you know, they're doing that very well. One of the sort of, would I call it philosophies for, economic philosophies for oil and gas contracts is the so-called Laffer curve, essentially, fiscal certainty. But you know, some countries have moved away from fiscal certainty to fiscal flexibility. So in a sense, you know, oil prospects and assets are being auctioned off today. You know, so you want to maximize revenues from fossil fuel, and then use the earning from fossil fuel to diversify your economic base from fossil fuel. That's really what the focus should be at this point in time. You know, so policies and initiatives, both in the public sector and the private sector, should really focus on that. And then, just as was summarized at the start of this, is that the energy transition, the transition fuel is gas. So energize gas as the transition fuel to drive economic growth, both as a source of energy and as input into a number of industrial processes in order to stimulate growth. You know, time is of the essence, and then pivot growth in oil to refining and oil derivatives. I think that we should begin to contemplate the day when fossil fuel will not be a major revenue earner for Nigeria. And I'm speaking specifically about Nigeria. You know, we need to contemplate that certain day, that the day will come that it will not be. And that the entire focus of, say, trillion of energy companies who have any access to oil, to licenses and leases, would be to strip out the derivatives and get into the sort of value add space. So the nature and the construct of the business will transform. But the shock to the Nigerian state and to a number of African states will be the slowdown of revenue, you know. But that's not likely to happen another 5 or 10 years, my assessment. So there's some time to plan. We're behind time, as it were. If you think about countries like Norway that have accumulated well over $1.2 trillion in terms of sovereign wealth fund from savings from, they are in pole position to be able to pivot. You see Saudi Arabia as one of the biggest producers, also putting itself in a very good position to be able to pivot and create a non-oil economy. We cannot have our heads in the sand and hope somehow that there will be one conflict or another that will keep the petroleum industry alive. Post net zero, I think that we can position ourselves to have the best of both worlds, i.e. energy independence on the back of the transition to renewables, and of course energy independence and security on the back of that, and a proper oil economy that is not emitting, as it were, it's not emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but we can find cleaner ways to take to extract some of the things we require for economic development and get to the place of the best of both worlds, as we say. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the ensuing conversations.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Mr. Ayi and Dr. Oko. This is a subject I've been interested in. I've sat in a lot of seminars, and I've done a lot of reading. And for me, I hope that this recording will be shared and the presentation will be shared after the meeting. This is the first time I've sat through the discussion, and it was not gloom and doom. And there was so many positives that came up, there was many opportunities. So for me, I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a discussion on how we as a country, as sub-region and Africa, can position ourselves to lead in this space. Most of the talk about that comes out around this space is about we're not ready to issue around security, climate justice, is usually in the negative. But as you guys have been able to so certainly put it, there is an opportunity and a positive. And we have an opportunity to lead in this space, both globally, on a global space. So I'm very happy about the outcome. I'm charged up, and I'm also looking forward to the session at the annual conference, because we are still going to run with the team about transition and energy security. So in terms of format, what I'll do, Dr. Oko and Mr. Ayi, I'll use the next 5 minutes just to have a discussion instead of a question and answer session with both of you. And we have some questions on the Q&A that we'll take in. So, Dr. Oko, with regards to the issue around sustainability in the context of Nigeria, what are your thoughts around that, with this issue around the barrier to enter for renewables, which is usually cost? We all have energy challenge in Nigeria. what's costing us to provide power is excessive, and the natural space to go is to go renewable. But there's this barrier to idea. What's your thought about renewables and sustainability, not only from mostly from an affordability point of view, but just the whole sustainable discussion around renewable options for Nigeria?
So, yeah, I mean, one of the things I forgot to mention was about the factors affecting energy transition, which include geopolitical instability, pressures from inflation, much as we can see happening now, supply chain challenges, and the fact that the generally electoral process of modern democracies are poorly suited to decades-long industrial challenges, such as the energy transition. So what we see is when a new government comes in, they don't feel obligated to, attend to or actually carry out the policies of the previous government, or during times of high pressure, say energy security or economic growth, they generally just scrap the playbook for decarbonization and climate change. And then there's also the challenge of skill sets. So having people who are qualified, who can actually do this. And then costs, like you mentioned. However, I will say this though, I think on the whole, renewables are not as costly, setting up renewables are not as costly as oil and gas, for example. Although we recently found out with the supply chain challenge that there was for the first time, it led to increase in wind turbines, for increase in costs for wind turbines by manufacturers. But I think the government has to step in. If we're serious about energy transition, then we would need incentives, we will need grants. I know that generally people, again, because there's energy security in Nigeria is not something that is highly talked about or that is much to write home about. There's a lot of people have generators and things like that to fill in those gaps when power goes down. But people also have inverters where they have batteries which store this energy when they have power. And some people actually have solar systems. So I think here in the UK, for example, there are incentives for developers to take grants out and actually put up these systems on new buildings. So that's something that can be adopted in Nigeria.
Thank you. So we want to have to go at the sustainability question too.
There's not much else to say about it. I mean, the good doctor is correct that, anytime you're dealing with the transition, change, okay, if we want to birth a new order, particularly if it is for the public good, then we have to reach into our toolkit to produce a number of the instruments that are there to facilitate it. So, for example, when we wanted to energize the deep water, we created a tax incentive for it. Yeah. 20-year tax incentive, which actually was around 20 years. And that's how we were able to birth the deep water here. Same thing for maintenance, I think had a tax holiday of 20 years. So it's not unlikely that you can put these things together from a capital injection point of view, from a tax incentive point of view, and all of that to essentially, helping to midwife the new order. But the way to look at this is to then see what the ultimate destination is or the goal is. And that's probably the way to tell the story. What sort of high points are you looking to meet in terms of climate goals, in terms of wealth creation goals, in terms of job creation goals, and the likes of it. And those would almost certainly justify, the application of those toolkits that I talked about.
Okay, thank you. 2 minutes past 3. We understand that people's time are very important. And at this point, I want to take it back to the SBL Secretariat for housekeeping and close. So I think silence means consent, and I want to thank everybody for taking time out. I think I can see that one of the slides have already been shared, and we'll share the audio recording and the slides with everyone. So thank you very much. It was really been nice spending time with Dr. Oko and Ejale. I want to thank you guys on behalf of the section of business law and on behalf of the attendees of this conference. Thank you very much, and hoping to do this sometime soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.